Do you think underground masses will be a part of the days to come?
They already are. But if it's only for a couple of years, actually, we can hang in there. And I think this is important because I don't want to see people lapsing, losing the faith, going over to schismatics. And unfortunately, people do. People lose faith. They have the heart taken out of them by the mistreatment coming from above. That's the problem with doing this kind of extraordinary campaign.
The leaked secret plan to ban the traditional Latin Mass. This has been being discussed all week long. Today, we're going to have Dr. Joseph Shaw on the team from the Latin Mass Society. Is it not so secret? That's one of the points, I think, because it seems like a lot of people at the Vatican are talking about it, know about it, have discussed it with the Pillar, for instance, and others like Don Montaigne at the Remnant. So it's not so secret, in my opinion. So what is their plan? What will be the impact of this? Dr. Joseph Shaw will weigh in on all of that.
By the way, my name is Joe McLean. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Dr. Shaw, good morning to you. Thank you for your time. Everybody knows that there's a group of prelates and dicastery leaders who dislike, hate, want to get rid of the traditional Latin Mass and would do anything they could to get it done. So it's not so secret, it seems to me. What is your opinion of that?
I think it's quite common for documents to do the rounds in the Vatican, go between one department and another, get comments and so on, feedback. And in itself, that's a perfectly healthy, normal part of making legislation. The whole thing is a bit opaque, of course, because it's the Vatican. It's all a bit 16th century. But in itself, I mean, that's fair enough. It's not a public document. It's a draft. No doubt there are different drafts. No doubt there are even rival drafts. As Diana Montaigne explained it in the Remnant, I mean, there has been various people pushing in different directions. So one of the things which has been obviously a matter of debate within the Curia among those who don't like traditional Mass is whether to go after diocesan celebrations or whether to go after the traditional institutes. And that's obviously going to make a big difference to Catholics on the ground. But it's they don't necessarily agree with themselves about that sort of thing.
So part of this leaked information is that the Ecclesia Communities, the Institute of Christ the King, Fraternity of St. Peter, and others, they're going to get to continue on, although there is serious question as to whether or not they will be allowed to ordain their priests in the traditional form, or baptisms, marriages, confirmations, etc. That seems to be a heavy hand in all of this, don't you think?
It certainly would be. If their apostolic work was limited to saying Mass, then they stopped making this kind of sense that we've always been told they were going to make. I mean, they're always intended. I mean, right from the start in 1988, when the fraternity was founded and others were reconciled to the Holy See, they were going to offer the traditional spiritual offering, to the faithful in its fullness. So all the sacraments, blessings, spirituality, and so on. That's what they're for. And that actually is why I think that it's quite unlikely that the hammer will come down on them, even to limit them like this. I think they're still, well, they're not exactly marginal, but it's still a minority of the traditional masses around the world are being celebrated by those priests. And I think that it would be a big enough victory for the time being to get rid of the diocesan celebrations.
One of the other aspects of this story that came out of the Remnant was they're talking about removing the privilege of the bishop. So bishops, if they wanted to say a private TLM in their own chapel with no one else around, they'd have to call home to the home office to get permission to do that. That seems rather draconian. I mean, it seems really, really... so in a government that supposedly was going to give us decentralization back in 2013, that was one of the promises of Pope Francis, to decentralize things. They've really kind of gone the opposite way here, and they're laying a heavy hand.
Certainly, the claim of decentralization has been proved to be, well, things haven't worked out like that in this area and in many areas of the church. So bishops are not allowed anymore to have established communities of diocesan right, for example, new communities, and all sorts of other things. However, I don't think, unless this would be specifically said in the legislation, this is not going to affect private masses. So for the bishops, or indeed for any priests, they'll continue to be able to allow. They will still be able to celebrate the traditional mass privately, which means without being advertised and scheduled, because the 1962 Missal, the traditional mass, is still not abrogated. It's still being permitted for some people, and all the stuff in Traditionis Custodes and the subsequent documents has been about public masses. So let's not run away with the idea that private masses will be affected. But for bishops have to ask permission to celebrate a public mass, and that seems extraordinary.
What is the big motivation here? Why does Cardinal Parolin and Fernandez and Viola, why do they want so much? Of all the things to focus on and all the troubles in the world today, why in the world is this a priority to them?
To begin to understand that, there are no doubt ideological and what we might call party political reasons, both of which are quite difficult to understand. But we were given an insight into the ideological side of it by Andrea Gurillo's strange interview with the Italian blog Messa in Latino, where he comes out with all this stuff, some of which we've heard before from him, about how it's kind of practically schismatic to have any liturgical variety in the church at all, not even making a distinction between the Latin Rite and the Eastern Rite, or between legitimate, different post-Vatican II rites in the Latin Church, of which there are several, including the Carthusians have their own rite. So, I mean, it's a strange argument of Grillo's, but obviously he believes it sincerely, and it's become a kind of big thing for him and for certain others who follow him. So that's one aspect of it. If you're bitten by that bug, then you just think that it's bad, and it doesn't matter how nice or nasty the trads are. It doesn't matter whether they're doing good work. It doesn't mean if they bring people back to the church. You just, you think it's theologically problematic, which is, of course, absurd, because there's always been liturgical variety in the church. It's a sign of health to have. In fact, this says exactly that in the Second Vatican Council, in the decree on the Eastern churches. It's a sign of health. Anyway, that's one aspect of it. But another, which I think is more affecting some of the cardinals, lining themselves up for the next conclave, is a sort of party politics of the Curia, and that is quite difficult for people outside the Curia to get any kind of handle on. And I think it's particularly difficult for us in the English-speaking world, who are not used to this kind of thing at all, that these, cardinals and their supporters, they kind of adopt causes, sometimes sincerely, sometimes purely opportunistically, just to show them, just to grab a certain cluster of votes which are available from, a certain group of cardinals at the next conclave, or to distinguish themselves from another candidate and things like that. So, we have Parolin appears to be making himself the champion of the people who don't like the traditional mass. Cardinal Zuppi, another Eternal Cardinal, appears to be making himself, the voice of reason, moderation and openness. Zuppi is not a conservative. He's the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, and he's quite liberal. But he's liberal in the sense that he'll allow these things, and has been quite a strong supporter of the traditional mass. So, what's going on there? Well, they're both, very prominent potential candidates, both Italian. So we've got a kind of a mirror image going on here. If one says one thing, perhaps the other one has to say the other. And I don't say that from any great knowledge. It just strikes me that obviously people are lining themselves up for the conclave.
It seems like there's a jealousy here. It seems like there's a jealousy on the fringes of envy, dare I say, to try to take away something that is growing and is healthy. Do you see it that way?
Well, yes. I basically do. I mean, I don't want to attribute, particular motives to people that we can't even identify. But certainly part of the psychological mix here is not just envy, but fear. So if any of our viewers have read the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov, why does the great empire fall? It's because the successful people, the ones who are going to build it up again, they get taken down by the people at the center. Because they are a threat. So, if you are
heading up this crumbling empire, actually the successful people are more frightening than the unsuccessful deputies.
I want to ask you, if this document does in fact drop, and the rumors are, I think July 16th, if I'm not mistaken, if it does at all come out, the Pope would have to obviously approve that. What will be the impact? What will be the ramifications of this? Because part of the conversation is, at least some within the traditional Mass communities, is they're funneling us into a bucket that's more easily controlled and even cut off in the long run. Stage 1, get rid of the diocesan side of things. Stage 2, get rid of the Ecclesia Dei side of things. What does that leave? The SSPX or Sedevacantists? What say you?
Yes, that it's one way of looking at it. There's a certain logic to that. I wouldn't want to assume too much about the kind of coherent long-term strategy of this, because I think an awful lot happens in the Vatican more or less by accident or by people taking what appears to them to the path of least resistance. Nevertheless, I think that's certainly a possibility, and I'm worried a bit about that. One of the odd things that maybe can't be explained because it's just a kind of random blip, in the picture is Pope Francis' attitude towards the SSPX. So as we know, the SSPX is not in full communion with the Holy See. It doesn't accept the authority of bishops in practice on the ground. They have 700 priests around the world and many apostolates, so they simply say Mass as they wish. So Pope Francis has actually given them privileges, has given them authority to hear confessions, is given them the ability to have marriages validated through the local bishop. And this seems pretty surprising, if Pope Francis is all about crushing the traditional Mass. So he's not all about crushing the traditional Mass. I mean, he's got complicated thoughts of his own. Maybe this annoys people around him who don't like the traditional Mass, or maybe it fits into this plan of funneling us into something that can be easily controlled. It's very difficult to tell. But certainly the loss of diocesan clergy celebrating the Mass would be a huge blow to the movement. And that's exactly why they want to do it, because through that means a lot of people including a lot of priests, are introduced to the traditional Mass who would not otherwise ever discover it. And it seeps into dioceses, it seeps into clergy meetings, into the attitude of seminarians, the way the seminarians are taught, and so on and so forth. So I think that there is that kind of seepage, which it's made explicit by some of these opponents of ours. The immediate effect will be they won't have ordinations, and there won't be masses celebrated by the public masses anyway by the diocesan priests. So what will happen is that the Ecclesia Dei apostolates will continue. They'll continue saying their masses. A lot of the diocesan celebrations will go underground. They'll become private masses, which people will be notified through WhatsApp groups and word of mouth. So it won't be quite the cataclysm that perhaps its supporters would hope for us. People will still be able to get to the traditional Mass, if they know which doors to knock on and stuff. But some things like even the weddings for the laity, or baptisms, that will be very difficult. Of course, we've been told that the SSPX can marry people validly with the cooperation of the local bishops, so perhaps people will go to the SSPX to get married, and that would be completely legitimate. I mean, that's very strange, but that seems to be what we're being told by the supreme legislator, should this transpire. But none of this will make all that much difference if this regime only goes on for 6 months or a year or 18 months or 2 years or something like that.
They want to do away with this forever. They want to make it permanent. Do you think they can make it permanent, or would the next pontificate, if it decided otherwise, just simply do away with all this document and then go on to doing whatever they wanted to?
Well, we've been given the example by Pope Francis himself that one bishop can tear up a very important document of his predecessor without any explanation or justification, without any kind of real consultation, just of his own bat.
despite the fact that it affects the pastoral lives of hundreds of thousands of Catholics all over the world. So that's the example that his predecessor will have to follow. So I'm sorry that no one in this world can bind his successors. You can't do something on the authority of the papacy and then say it can't be undone. So of course his successor can change it. Of course he can. And people will be screaming at him to do so. I mean, I don't mean us, layer people. I mean the bishops. They'll be saying to him, we've got a massive pastoral problem here. We've got people going over to the SSPX. We've got Latins worshipping with the Uniate churches. We've got people having their marriages, validated through the SSPX, and we can't stop them doing that. And it's kind of chaos, and our priests are unhappy, and donations have dropped, and we've got problems. People aren't coming to seminary because they think they're going to be forbidden from celebrating the Mass. Please help us out here. And the Pope, if he's got any sense, will say, well, let's think about this in an open-minded way and weigh out the pros and cons. This is a long-term issue. There are people out there trying to solve it with a very short-term mindset, and they're not going to succeed. Who knows how long Pope Francis has gone? God alone knows that. But what we do know is that this is going to go on beyond this point. Pontificate. We're not going away.
There's this famous 1971 statement that was sent to the Vatican by famous people that were not Catholic at the time, Agatha Christie, Graham Greene being among them. But there was a bunch of others. Maybe most of those names we don't remember anymore. But why would they do that, Dr. Shaw? Why would non-Catholics in England protest to the Vatican about getting rid of the Church and Latin Mass in England? Why would they do that?
Well, some were Catholics, in fact. And also, this was part of an even bigger petition, which was signed by people in Italy and Spain and Latin America and stuff. In fact, even a couple of Americans, Robert Lovell, the poet, signed it, and a lady called Juna Barnes, who was a kind of proto-feminist, wrote a book called The Book of Repulsive Women. So all sorts of
times.
People. And they were familiar with the traditional Mass, and I think that it's important to remember back in the 60s and early 70s, everyone knew about it. So, there are shots of it in films, and you go to it if your Catholic colleague got married or was buried or whatever. So you'd have some idea about it. You see it in art. If you're a cultured person, you'd know about the music and stuff. So these days, most non-Catholic celebrities, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, but in those days they did. And although they weren't Catholics, many of them, they saw it as something that the church had, which was amazing. And even if they didn't agree with it, from an artistic point of view, it was amazing. And for it to disappear from human, culture was a tragedy. So, it's a bit like, imagine, the French state saying, "Oh yeah, we got this Mona Lisa thing, and we're fed up with it. We're gonna drop it into an acid bath." And people would say, "Oh no, you mustn't do that."
Right.
Well, why not? It belongs to the French state. No, you mustn't do that because in a sense, this belongs to everyone. Even people who aren't French, even people who aren't Italian, even people who've never been to visit it. It's something of this value. And in fact, people were thinking about that a lot in the 60s because Venice had been flooded and Florence had been flooded, and the Aswan Dam was being built and flooding vast areas of Egypt, and people were desperately saving Egyptian antiquities. And I think there's an Egyptian temple in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that was physically moved there to save it from the Aswan Dam flooding. So people were thinking about this, and in terms of culture and heritage, and these are fragile things. And the Mass, of course, is something which is kept alive by being said. You can't preserve it in a museum, in a book, in a recording even. It's alive because it's said, and people worship with it who believe in it. And that is part of, life's rich pattern. Even if you're not a Catholic, even if you think they're kind of a bit deluded, it's part of the richness of human culture. And that's still true today, of course.
they're trying to force these ex ecclesia Dei priests to celebrate masses, which is not something they do. There's a level of vitriol in this that I detect, but maybe I'm just being biased in this. You seem to be way more balanced than me on it. So what do you think?
Well, I'm afraid I agree with you. I think this is a ritual humiliation towards these priests who are quite willing to go to these masses, inquire, who are quite willing to use the holy oils blessed by the bishop, who say the bishop's name every time they celebrate mass. Even the SSPX priests, incidentally, they say the bishop's name wherever they are, and the Pope's name. But that's not enough. These signs, which have been used for over 1,000 years to indicate the priest's unity with the hierarchy, they're not enough. Instead, you've got to get them to do something which is against their conscience. It's really, it's absolutely appalling. It's like as I say, it's a ritual humiliation. It's a way of, rubbing their noses in it. I think that it'd be wrong to force them, if they didn't want to watch, when Harry met Sally, because they find it kind of sentimental and annoying. Well, you should force people to do things like that. It's ridiculous. And that's for forcing someone to do something which has got spiritual content. In relation to the sacraments, what sort of a manipulative person would want to force a priest to celebrate Mass in a way that it just was wrong, sat wrong with him? That's an extraordinary thing to do. I'm afraid it's abusive. Well, it reminds me of Michael Rose's book, Goodbye Good Men, when he talks about what happens in seminaries, and the seminary directors deliberately force conservative seminarians to engage in liturgical acts which downplay, to put it mildly, the Blessed Sacrament, the reality of the Blessed Sacrament, in order to humiliate them, to demoralize them, ultimately to break their faith. So there's one really horrifying example in that book where a priest has just given Holy Communion, and he has a paten with fragments on it, and he blows the fragments onto the floor in front of these seminarians in order to teach them a lesson, as he would say. Oh, yes, I want to teach them a lesson about how, it's not really, the presence of Christ isn't really there, except when you're actually receiving it, or some kind of Calvinist kind of, theory like that. Well,
Wow.
It's spiritual abuse. And that we're coming close to that kind of thing here, that there isn't a kind of parallel as well. It's a partial parallel, of course, but there's a dissimilarity between the two cases. Supposing I were to force, Novus Ordo Catholic to come to traditional Mass, well, he would see the things that he held most holy in the Church being treated with a degree of holiness which he thought was a bit over the top. Okay, so that's one thing. You take a traditional Catholic and force him to go to some sort of, terrible, abusive Novus Ordo Mass, he would see the things he held most holy being treated with contempt. That's not the same. So if I were to go to many masses taking place in within 30 miles of my home, I would see things which I think are scandalous. A Novus Ordo Catholic wouldn't be scandalized by going to traditional Mass, not in the same way. But unfortunately, we all know these abuses are very widespread. Successive popes have tried to suppress them and have failed to do so. There's piles and piles of legislation against them, and yet they still take place. So saying, these traditional Catholics, they should go to the Novus Ordo. Well, what exactly are you exposing them to? You're not exposing them to what the Church has asked. You're exposing them to something much, much worse than that. Love of the tradition, love of the Church. And that's what it comes down to. It's okay, and I like you, I don't blame anyone for going to the Novus Ordo, and if that floats your boat spiritually, then that's absolutely fine. But there is such a thing as loving the Church's tradition, which includes its liturgical tradition, which is actually incumbent on Catholics. And if you've been, if that motivates you, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That's a virtue, not a vice. So, we who have been inspired in this way, we shouldn't be discouraged. We should be encouraged to preserve this and make it as beautiful as possible. And it's bizarre for the Church to say to us, for the Church authorities to say to us, oh, no, that's all wrong. You shouldn't be going to these services with Gregorian chant, which the Vatican II called for. ad orientem, which which Vatican II never condemned, with all these other things which actually the Church has never criticized or condemned, because we want you to take part in something which is not authorized, explicitly by any general council. In many cases, as I said before, I mean, it's not even authorized by the liturgical law. But and as the other aspect, of course, is that when I used to go to the Novus Ordo, I was a pain in the neck because I used to notice, I thought, there's something not right about this. I used to look up things in documents and stuff and write letters to priests. I'm so much nicer now than I was then because I just, let them get on with it, I think now. I got my own mass to go to. And actually, that makes for liturgical peace.
Yeah.
To let people go to what they want to go to.
Do you think underground masses will be a part of the days to come?
They already are. They're already here. So yes, and I say underground. As I mentioned before, private masses, priests celebrating private masses. Of course, they can celebrate private masses, and when they celebrate private mass, they can use any legitimate form of the liturgy. So they can celebrate the traditional mass if they're able to do so. And can people attend those masses? Of course they can. Will those masses fulfill their Sunday obligations? Yes, of course it does. Look at the Code of Canon Law. There's no restriction it doesn't have to be a public mass. So we're talking about a phenomenon which is, in most cases, the cases I'm thinking of, totally licit. So there's nothing naughty about this. It's a peculiar situation. Unfortunately, people have to take this, to this degree, but they're not breaking any rules. So, but yes, it's happening. People go to these masses on a weekday or on a Sunday, and it's because they can't be advertised anymore. In some cases, bishops are actually encouraging priests to do this. Oh, just carry on, but don't advertise it. Carry on for the people, for your regulars. The advantage of this situation for our opponents is that it can't really grow. Not very fast anyway.
Right.
But if it's only for a couple of years, actually, we can hang in there. And I think this is important because I don't want to see people lapsing, losing the faith, going over to schismatics. That would be terrible. And unfortunately, people do. People lose faith. People, are discouraged. They have the heart taken out of them by the mistreatment coming from above. And well, I mean, that's the problem with doing this kind of extraordinary campaign. In some ways, Traditionis Concedes has made it grow even more. So you see the numbers of the Chartres pilgrimage going up and up and up every year, and our own pilgrimages in England as well. We have a walking pilgrimage to Walsingham. The numbers have shot up since then because it's shone a spotlight onto it. And I think maybe that's why they're getting desperate, wanting to take sterner and sterner measures against us, because they realise actually what they've done so far has to some extent actually backfired.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.